For most of human history, nothing changed. Then suddenly, everything did. Sit with that for a moment. Let it sink in. Thousands of generations lived and died making the same stone tools, hunting the same animals, sheltering in the same caves. No progress, no invention, no spark. Then something happened. Around 100,000 years ago, the record shifts. The archaeological evidence fractures into something unrecognizable. Suddenly there are beads, pigments, patterns etched into bone, burials with deliberate care, objects carried hundreds of miles from their origin. The world did not change. The climate did not suddenly cooperate. No meteor struck. No divine hand reached down. The land was the same. The animals were the same. Even the human body was essentially the same. So what was different? The mind. Something inside the human brain reorganized itself. Some threshold was crossed, some invisible bridge completed, and a creature that had wandered the earth for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly began to think in ways it never had before. Picture the deep past. 2 million years ago, early human ancestors chipped rocks into crude shapes. Those shapes worked. They cut meat. They scraped hides. And for over 1 million years, that was enough. Generation after generation replicated the same design. No one improved it. No one asked if there was a better way. Now picture a different scene. A cave in southern Africa. Firelight flickers against red walls. A woman presses a sharpened stone into a piece of ochre and draws a line. Then another. Then a crosshatch pattern that means something only she understands. That moment separates two worlds. Before it, humans survived. After it, humans created meaning. This is the mystery at the heart of our story. Not when humans appeared on Earth. Not when they learned to walk upright or mastered fire. The real mystery is when they began to think symbolically. When they began to imagine things that did not exist. You are alive today because of that shift. Every word you hear right now, every concept, every dream, every fear you have ever named exists because of something that awakened in the mind roughly 100,000 years ago. And no one knows exactly what triggered it. That is what this documentary will explore. Not a simple answer. Not a neat timeline. But the deep, strange, wonderful puzzle of how a quiet animal became the most powerful force on the planet without changing its body at all. We will walk through the evidence together. Slowly. Carefully. Like archaeologists brushing dust from a fragment of bone. We will uncover what the record tells us and what it leaves frustratingly silent. There are clues scattered across continents. In the Blombos Cave of South Africa, where engraved ochre pieces date to nearly 100,000 years ago. In the shell beads of North Africa, strung together with intention and design. In the burial sites of the Levant, where Neanderthals and early modern humans place bodies in careful positions, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with tools. What did they believe? What were they hoping for? What world beyond the visible had they begun to imagine? We will also confront the uncomfortable silences. The vast stretches of time where nothing appears in the record. Not because nothing happened, perhaps, but because we cannot yet read the signs. The past does not speak clearly. It whispers. And sometimes it lies. The traditional story told by archaeologists for decades was simple. Humans evolved big brains. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something clicked. Art exploded across Europe. Cave paintings appeared. Complex tools proliferated. This was called the Great Leap Forward. But that story has been crumbling for years. The evidence now suggests the leap was not sudden and not confined to Europe. It was gradual, uneven, and it began in Africa far earlier than anyone initially suspected. The spark did not ignite in one place. It smoldered across the continent for tens of thousands of years. This changes everything we thought we knew. It means the transformation was not like flipping a switch. It was more like a slow dawn. white gathering at the horizon long before the sun breaks through. Different populations developing different capacities at different times. Trading ideas when they met, losing them when they separated. It means the story of human consciousness is messier, more beautiful, and more human than any simple narrative allows. So let us begin at the beginning. Not with the leap itself, but with the long, strange silence that preceded it. The era when humans had every physical tool they needed to change the world, and yet, for reasons we are only beginning to understand, did not. The time before the awakening. The age of the great standstill. What you will discover in the chapters ahead may unsettle you. It may make you look at your own thoughts differently. Because the mind you are using to process these words right now is the product of a transformation so profound, so mysterious, that science still cannot fully explain it. You carry inside your skull the most complex object known to exist in the universe. And for most of its history, it barely used a fraction of its potential. Why? What held it back? And what, at last, set it free? These are the questions that will guide us through the long night of human prehistory and into the first fragile light of symbolic thought. Stay with me. The answers are stranger than you might expect. The journey begins not with brilliance, but with monotony. With a world where nothing changed for so long that the very concept of change had no meaning. A world you would barely recognize. And yet a world inhabited by people who looked almost exactly like you. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing among them. Chapter 2. The Great Standstill Before the Leap. Imagine a world where time moves but nothing advances. Where centuries pass like identical beads on an infinite string. Where your grandchildren will use the same tools your grandparents used. Where no one invents. No one experiments. No one wonders if there might be another way. This was the world for most of human existence. We call it the Great Standstill. Not because people were frozen. They were active, resourceful, tough. They survived ice ages and droughts. They crossed rivers and climbed mountains. They raised children and buried their dead. But the material record of their lives barely changed. This is not speculation. The evidence is in the stones. The Acheulean hand axe is perhaps the most iconic tool in human history. Teardrop-shaped, carefully flaked on both sides, balanced in the palm. It appeared roughly 1.7 million years ago. And it persisted, with only the most minor variations, for over 1 million years. Think about that timescale. 1 million years of the same tool. In our modern world, technology transforms within a single decade. A phone from 10 years ago looks ancient. A car from 50 years ago belongs in a museum. We cannot even comprehend a century of stagnation, let alone 1 million years of it. But that is precisely what the archaeological record shows. Across Africa, across the Middle East, across parts of Asia and Europe, the same basic toolkit appears again and again. Hand axes, cleavers, simple scrapers, functional, effective, unchanging. The beings who made these tools were not stupid. Their brains were large. By 500,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis had a brain nearly as large as ours. They hunted large game cooperatively. They controlled fire in at least some regions. They were capable, and yet they were stagnant. Why does this matter? Because it reveals something profound about intelligence. Having a big brain is not enough. Raw processing power does not automatically produce creativity. Something else is needed. Some additional capacity. Some different way of connecting information. A supercomputer sitting in a warehouse, unprogrammed, does nothing. It has all the hardware. It lacks the software. And for hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain was like that supercomputer. Powerful, dormant, waiting. Let us walk through the daily life of these ancient people to understand what the standstill actually looked like. Imagine a small band of Homo heidelbergensis moving through an East African savanna 300,000 years ago. The morning begins with foraging. Women and older children fan out across the grassland, searching for tubers, seeds, and insects. They know the landscape intimately. They know where water collects after rain. They know which plants are toxic. This is knowledge. Real, practical, life-sustaining knowledge. Passed from parent to child through demonstration and imitation. But it is knowledge without abstraction. It answers the question of what to do. It never asks why. It never asks what if. The men prepare for a hunt. They carry wooden spears, sharpened by fire. Some carry hand axes for butchering. They move together, communicating through gestures and simple vocalizations. They are effective predators. They can bring down animals far larger than themselves. But their weapons do not change. The spear design they carry today is the same their ancestors carried 50,000 years before. No one has added a stone tip. No one has invented a throwing device. No one has tried binding a sharp flake to a shaft. The technology works. It keeps them alive. And that, it seems, is enough. Evening falls. The band gathers around the fire. Children play at the edges of the light. There is grooming, perhaps vocalizing, the social bonding that holds the group together. But there are no stories, no songs as we would recognize them, no art. We cannot know this with certainty. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Perhaps they painted on bark that rotted away. Perhaps they sang songs that left no trace. This is a fair objection, and we should hold it gently throughout our exploration. But the weight of evidence suggests something is missing. When symbolic behavior does finally appear in the record, it leaves traces everywhere. Ochre pigments stain cave floors. Engraved patterns survive on stone and bone. Shell beads accumulate in living sites. Once the symbolic mind awakens, it marks everything it touches. The absence of such markers for hundreds of thousands of years is therefore telling, not conclusive, but telling. There is another clue to the standstill that deserves attention: population size. For most of the deep past, human populations were extremely small. Genetic studies suggest that total numbers sometimes drop to just a few thousand individuals across the entire planet. Small populations are vulnerable to what scientists call cultural drift. Skills can be lost. Innovations that arise in one group may die with that group. There is no network to preserve and transmit new ideas. Knowledge is fragile when only a handful of minds hold it. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Perhaps the standstill was not purely a cognitive limitation. Perhaps it was also a demographic one. Too few people, too isolated, too vulnerable to the randomness of extinction and forgetting. We will return to this idea later. It becomes important when we try to explain why the awakening, when it came, was so uneven. Why it flickered in one region and went dark. Why it smoldered for millennia before catching fire. But demographics alone cannot explain everything, because the tools themselves reveal a mind that processes the world differently than ours does. A mind that copies but does not innovate. That remembers but does not recombine. That sees the world as it is without imagining how it could be. This is the heart of the standstill. Not a lack of intelligence, a lack of imagination. And before you judge these ancient ancestors harshly, consider this: they survived. For hundreds of thousands of years, in some of the harshest environments on Earth, they endured. They raised families. They cared for the sick and injured. The fossil record shows healed bones. They were fully human in their emotions, their bonds, their courage. They simply lacked the one capacity that would eventually change everything: the ability to hold an idea in the mind that has no physical form, to think in symbols, to imagine the invisible. That capacity was coming. Slowly, invisibly, the neural architecture was shifting. Connections were forming that had never existed before. The hardware was being rewired. But the transformation would not announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It would begin quietly, almost imperceptibly. in the hands of a few individuals who picked up a lump of red earth and saw in it something no one had ever seen before, something that did not exist in the physical world at all. Chapter 3. Why big brains change so little. Here is the paradox that haunted scientists for decades. The human brain reached roughly its modern size by 300,000 years ago. Homo sapiens appeared with the same cranial capacity you carry today, the same folds, the same general architecture. And yet, for most of those 300,000 years, that magnificent brain produced almost nothing we would recognize as culture. No art, no music, no complex tools, no trade networks, no symbols. Nothing that separates human behavior from the behavior of other clever primates beyond a slightly more sophisticated toolkit. The brain was there. The mind, as we know it, was not. This is deeply counterintuitive. We assume that intelligence produces innovation, that a bigger brain means more creativity, that evolution builds toward progress. But the fossil record tells a different story. A story where hardware and software evolve on completely different timelines. Let us be precise about what we mean by a big brain. The average modern human brain weighs about 3 pounds and contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Each neuron connects to thousands of others, creating a network of staggering complexity. This organ consumes 20% of your body's energy while representing only 2% of your mass. It is expensive, dangerous, even. Large skulls make childbirth perilous. Big brains demand constant fuel. An organism does not evolve such a costly organ without tremendous selective pressure driving it. So what was driving it? The traditional answer pointed to tool use. Smarter individuals made better tools. Better tools meant more food. More food supported bigger brains, a feedback loop spiraling upward. It is an elegant theory, but it has a fatal flaw. The tools did not get better. If brain size and tool complexity were linked in a simple feedback loop, we would expect to see tools improving steadily as brains grew larger. We do not see this. We see brains expanding dramatically while tools remained essentially static for enormous stretches of time. Something else was driving brain growth. And whatever that something was, it was not immediately expressed in material culture. Many researchers now believe the primary driver was social complexity. Living in groups requires an extraordinary amount of cognitive processing. You must remember faces, track relationships, detect cheaters, form alliances, manage conflicts, and predict the behavior of others. This is the social brain hypothesis, and it has powerful evidence behind it. Across primate species, brain size correlates more strongly with social group size than with any ecological variable. The bigger your group, the bigger your brain needs to be. For early humans, group living was essential for survival. Predators were everywhere. Food was scattered and seasonal. Cooperative hunting and foraging allowed access to resources no individual could obtain alone. But cooperation demands trust, and trust demands a brain that can model other minds. So the brain grew, not to make better hand axes, not to invent art, but to navigate the treacherous, subtle, endlessly complex landscape of social life, to know who to trust, who to avoid, who was likely to share food, who might steal your mate. This explains the paradox beautifully. The big brain was busy. It was working hard, but it was working on social problems, not technological ones. Its enormous processing power was devoted to reading faces, interpreting gestures, managing relationships, and maintaining group cohesion. It was, in essence, a social computer. And it was spectacular at its job, but it was not yet a symbolic computer. It could process the present in exquisite detail. It could remember the past with great fidelity. What it could not yet do was imagine things that had never existed. Concepts without physical form, meanings attached to arbitrary shapes. The wiring was not yet complete. Think of it this way. Your brain is a vast network of regions, each specialized for different tasks. Vision here, language there, emotion deep in the center, memory tucked behind the temples, motor control near the top, planning right behind the forehead. What makes the modern human mind extraordinary is not any single region. It is the connections between regions, the ability to blend information from completely different domains, to hear a sound and see a color, to attach a meaning to a shape, to feel an emotion about an abstraction. This cross-domain connectivity, this ability to merge disparate streams of information into unified symbolic thought, appears to have been the last piece of the cognitive puzzle to fall into place. The regions existed. The connections between them were still being built. Neuroscience offers tantalizing clues. Studies of modern human brains reveal extraordinarily dense connections in the prefrontal cortex and between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions. These connections support working memory, planning, abstract thought, and symbolic reasoning. Fossil skulls cannot reveal neural connections directly, but they can reveal brain shape. And the shape of the human skull has changed subtly over the past 300,000 years. The forehead has become more vertical. The brain case has become more globular. These shape changes correspond to expansion in precisely the regions associated with higher cognitive function. The prefrontal cortex, the temporal parietal junction, the areas that bind perception, memory, and abstraction into a unified experience. The brain was not just big. It was reorganizing. This reorganization was not a single event. It was a gradual process, unfolding over tens of thousands of years, driven by genetic mutations that altered neural development in subtle but profound ways. A gene here, changing the timing of neuron growth. A regulatory sequence there altering how connections form. We know of at least one gene intimately involved in this process. FOXP2, sometimes called the language gene, though that is an oversimplification. Mutations in FOXP2 affect the fine motor control of the mouth and throat, essential for speech. But its effects reach far deeper into neural architecture. There are others, SPM, microcephalin, HAR1, genes that evolved rapidly in the human lineage, genes associated with brain development, genes whose precise functions we are only beginning to map. Somewhere in this genetic reshuffling, the capacity for symbolic thought emerged, not as a single mutation, not as a dramatic overnight transformation, but as a slow accumulation of neural changes that gradually crossed a threshold. Below that threshold, you have a brilliant social animal, cooperative, emotional, resourceful, but bound to the concrete, the present, the tangible. Above that threshold, you have something the universe had never produced before. A mind that can hold an idea with no physical form. A creature that can represent the world with arbitrary symbols and share those symbols with others. A being that can imagine what does not exist and then bring it into existence. This is the leap. Not a leap of the body, not a leap of brain size. A leap of connectivity, of integration, of the final wiring that transformed a social brain into a symbolic mind. And the first faint evidence of this transformation was about to appear, in red dust, in pierced shells, in scratches on stone that meant nothing to the physical world and everything to the mind that made them. The standstill was ending, but it would end so quietly that for thousands of years you might not even notice, unless you knew exactly where to look. Chapter 4. The first signs of a new mind. The first evidence of the new mind does not arrive with grandeur. There are no great monuments, no elaborate cave paintings, no cities rising from the plains. The first signs are small, almost trivially small. A lump of red stone with scratches on its surface. But those scratches changed everything. Blombos Cave sits on the southern coast of South Africa, overlooking the Indian Ocean. It is a modest cavity in a limestone cliff, unremarkable from the outside. Inside, layers of sediment record tens of thousands of years of human habitation. In the year 2000, archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood announced a discovery from the deepest layers that would reshape our understanding of human cognitive evolution. Two pieces of ochre, a soft iron oxide stone, engraved with deliberate geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines, repeated, rhythmic, intentional. They were approximately 77,000 years old. Let that settle in your mind. 77,000 years ago, someone sat in this cave above the sea and carved a pattern into a stone, not to make a tool, not to butcher an animal, not for any practical purpose that anyone has been able to identify. They carved it because the pattern meant something. This is the signature of symbolic thought, the creation of meaning that exists only in the mind. A crosshatch pattern on ochre is functionally useless. It does not cut. It does not scrape. It does not hold water. Its value is entirely abstract. An abstract value is the foundation of everything human. But Blombos was only the beginning. Henshelwood's team continued excavating, and the cave continued to yield treasures. Shell beads made from tiny nacreous shells, each pierced with a hole, each showing wear patterns consistent with being strung on a cord. These beads are roughly 75,000 years old. Someone collected these shells, prepared them carefully, and wore them. This is personal ornamentation, jewelry, and jewelry is never just decoration. It is communication. A bead on a string says something. It might say I belong to this group, or I have this status, or I am available for partnership. The specific message does not matter for our purposes. What matters is that a message exists at all, that an object has been recruited to carry meaning beyond its physical nature. This is the symbolic threshold in action. You wear symbols every day without thinking about it. A wedding ring, a university sweatshirt, a brand logo on your shoes. Each object carries meaning that is entirely separate from its physical function. A ring does not keep your finger warm. It announces a commitment. 75,000 years ago, someone in a cave in South Africa understood this principle. Perhaps not consciously. Perhaps not with the explicit awareness you bring to choosing your clothes. But the behavior is unmistakable. Objects were being used as symbols. And the evidence extends beyond Blombos. At Pinnacle Point, another South African coastal site, researchers found evidence of ochre use dating back 164,000 years. The ochre was ground into powder, presumably for use as pigment, body painting perhaps, or the decoration of objects or surfaces. 164,000 years. The symbolic mind may have been stirring far earlier than anyone imagined. In North Africa, the picture is equally compelling. At the cave of Grotte des Pigeons in Morocco, perforated nacreous shells were found in layers dating to approximately 82,000 years ago. Similar beads appeared at Oued Jebana in Algeria, dated to around 90,000 years ago. The geography is significant. These sites are thousands of miles apart. Southern Africa, Northern Africa. The symbolic behaviors are appearing independently across the continent. This is not one isolated genius having a flash of inspiration. This is a species-wide cognitive shift, or is it? Here is where the mystery deepens. Because these early signs of symbolic thought are not continuous. They flicker. They appear in the record and then vanish for thousands of years before reappearing somewhere else. The signal is intermittent, fragile, maddeningly inconsistent. At Blombos, the engraved ochre and shell beads appear in a specific layer. Above that layer, the symbolic artifacts disappear. The subsequent occupants of the cave left behind perfectly functional tools, but no art, no beads, no pigment. The light came on and then went dark. This pattern repeats across Africa. Symbolic behaviors emerge, persist for a few thousand years, then vanish from the local record. They pop up elsewhere, endure briefly, and fade again. the awakening was not a single event. It was a series of false starts. Why would a new cognitive ability appear and disappear like this? Several explanations have been proposed, and each illuminates a different aspect of the puzzle. The first is demographic. Small, isolated populations can lose cultural innovations through simple bad luck. If the only people who know how to make beads die in a drought, the knowledge dies with them. Cultural memory requires a minimum population to sustain itself. The second is environmental. During harsh climatic periods, populations contract. Groups fragment and lose contact with one another. The social networks that transmit and reinforce symbolic behavior collapse. People focus on survival, and the fragile new behaviors are the first casualties. The third explanation is more subtle and perhaps more profound. The cognitive capacity for symbolic thought may have existed as a potential long before it was consistently expressed. Like a language you learn but rarely speak, it was present but dormant, activated only under specific social conditions. This last idea is particularly haunting. It suggests that the symbolic mind was not simply switched on by a genetic mutation. It was enabled by genetics, but activated by culture. You needed both the neural hardware and the social environment that encouraged its use. Without a community that valued symbols, the capacity for symbolic thought lay sleeping. It took the right combination of population density, social complexity, and perhaps environmental pressure to wake it fully and keep it awake. And this is exactly what we see in the record. As populations grew and stabilized, as groups made more frequent contact with one another, the symbolic behaviors became more persistent, more elaborate, more widespread. The flickering light steadied into a flame. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay with these earliest signs a little longer, because they deserve our attention and our wonder. Imagine the person who carved the crosshatch pattern at Blombos. We do not know if it was a man or a woman. We do not know their name or their age. We know almost nothing about them as an individual, but we know they did something no other species on Earth had ever done. They took a piece of the world and made it mean something it had never meant before. They imposed order on chaos, pattern on randomness, meaning on matter. In that single act, they crossed a boundary that separated animal from human in the deepest possible sense. Not biologically. Biologically, they had been human for a long time. But cognitively, symbolically, spiritually, if you choose that word, they became something new. And we are their descendants. Every one of us. Every symbol we create, from alphabet letters to mathematical equations to digital code, traces its lineage back to that moment. To a hand pressing stone against stone in a cave above the sea. The ochre at Blombos whispers to us across 77,000 years. It says the mind was waking up, slowly, uncertainly, with no guarantee of success. But the most remarkable chapter of this awakening was yet to come. Because the scattered flickering evidence we have seen so far was only the prologue. Something was building across the African continent. Networks of exchange were forming. Populations were growing. Ideas were beginning to flow between groups. And within those flows, a new kind of thought was crystallizing. Not just symbols on stone, not just beads on a string, but something far more powerful. Something that would allow humans to cooperate in ways no species had ever achieved. To share not just food and tools, but beliefs and stories and plans for a future no one had yet seen. The next phase of the awakening would transform not just individual minds, but entire societies. And the evidence for it would come from the most unexpected places. From the chemistry of ancient pigments, from the geometry of stone blades, from the silent testimony of objects carried impossible distances across a changing landscape. What happened next would set the stage for everything that followed. Every civilization, every religion, every work of art, every scientific discovery would trace its roots to the transformation that was now, at last, beginning to gather unstoppable momentum. The mind was no longer just flickering. It was about to catch fire. Chapter 5. Why Nature Did Not Cause the Shift. There is a tempting story that almost everyone believes. It goes like this. The climate changed. Africa dried out. The forests shrank. Our ancestors were forced onto open savannas. And there, under pressure, they got smarter. It sounds clean. It sounds logical. It is also almost certainly incomplete. Let us be honest about what the climate did do. It mattered. Of course, it mattered. Over the last million years, Africa experienced dramatic oscillations. Ice ages gripped the northern hemisphere. In Africa, this meant cycles of brutal drought followed by periods of generous rainfall. Lakes appeared and vanished. Forests expanded and contracted like breathing lungs. Coastlines shifted by miles as sea levels rose and fell. The landscape your ancestors knew could become unrecognizable within a few generations. This was real. This shaped bodies and behaviors. But here is the problem with the climate explanation. Every animal in Africa faced the same climate shifts. Every primate, every antelope, every predator, every bird. They all endured the same droughts. They all survived the same floods. They all adapted to the same contracting forests and expanding grasslands. Yet none of them developed symbolic thought. None of them started engraving geometric patterns onto pieces of ochre. None of them began stringing shell beads into necklaces. None of them buried their dead with apparent ceremony. None of them painted images on cave walls. Climate changed everything about Africa. But climate alone did not change the human mind. Consider the baboons. They survived every climate oscillation our ancestors faced. They lived in the same regions. They ate similar foods. They dealt with the same predators. They are intelligent, social, adaptable primates with complex hierarchies. Baboons today are essentially what baboons were 500,000 years ago. Smart, successful, unchanged in their fundamental cognition. The climate pushed them around the landscape, yes, but it never pushed them towards symbolic revolution. The same is true of every other large-brained mammal in Africa during this period. Now consider something else. The cognitive revolution did not track neatly with any specific climate event. If drought alone sparked symbolic thinking, we would expect to see the earliest symbolic artifacts appearing during the most severe dry periods. Sometimes that correlation holds loosely, but often it does not. The engraved ochre at Blombos Cave dates to roughly 77,000 years ago. That period was not particularly catastrophic climatically. The shell beads from North Africa at 90,000 years ago come from a relatively stable period. And the earliest known use of ochre at Pinnacle Point, 164,000 years ago, does coincide with a challenging climate period. The people had been living through equally challenging periods for hundreds of thousands of years without producing such artifacts. The timing is inconsistent. The evidence is scattered. The climate model alone cannot explain the pattern. Here is what makes this puzzle even deeper. Some of the most extreme climate crises in African prehistory produced no visible cognitive leaps at all. Around 135,000 years ago, Africa experienced a megadrought so severe that geneticists believe the total human population may have crashed to fewer than 10,000 individuals. Think about that number. Fewer people than a small town, scattered across an entire continent, hanging on the edge of extinction. That was the most intense climate pressure our species ever faced. And the archaeological record from that exact period is nearly silent. No explosion of innovation. No sudden burst of symbolic artifacts. Just small, desperate populations surviving however they could. If climate pressure alone drove cognitive evolution, that megadrought should have been the greatest accelerator in human history. Instead, it nearly ended us. So something else was happening. Something the climate model misses entirely. The environment was not irrelevant. Let us be clear about that. Climate created the conditions. It shuffled populations. It isolated groups on coastlines and in mountain refugia. It forced people into new territories and new diets. But the conditions alone were not the cause. Imagine a chemistry analogy. Climate provided the ingredients and the heat. But the actual reaction, the transformation of the human mind, required a catalyst that the environment alone could not supply. That catalyst was not geological. It was not botanical. It was social. And this is where the story takes its most important turn. Because while every animal in Africa faced the same droughts and the same predators, no other animal faced what humans faced. No other animal lived in groups where the most dangerous, most unpredictable, most consequential force in your environment was not the weather. It was the person standing next to you. We are about to enter the true engine room of human cognitive evolution. And what you will find, there is not a story about nature forcing change from the outside. It is a story about minds forcing change from within, pressing against each other, escalating endlessly. The climate set the stage, but the actors created the drama themselves. What happened next was an arms race unlike anything evolution had ever produced. Chapter 6. When humans became each other's greatest pressure. Imagine, you are living 150,000 years ago in a small group of perhaps 30 to 50 people somewhere in Eastern Africa. You know every face. You have known most of them since birth. These are the people you depend on for survival. And they are also the most complex problem you will ever face. This is the heart of what scientists call the social brain hypothesis. And it is arguably the most important idea in the entire story of human cognitive evolution. More important than tools. More important than fire. More important than climate. The idea is deceptively simple. The primary driver of human brain expansion was not the need to make better tools. It was not the need to navigate complex landscapes. It was not the need to track prey across long distances. It was the need to navigate complex social relationships. Your survival depended on other people, and other people were unpredictable. Think about what social life actually required in a small band of early humans. You needed to remember who had helped you and who had not. You needed to track alliances. You needed to anticipate betrayals. You needed to know who was trustworthy. You needed to read faces. You needed to interpret gestures. You needed to understand what someone else was thinking without them telling you. You needed to model other minds inside your own mind. This is staggeringly complex computation. No other survival challenge even comes close. Finding food follows patterns. Avoiding predators follows patterns. Weather follows patterns. But another human mind does not follow patterns. It strategizes. It deceives. It changes its strategy based on what it thinks you are thinking. This is recursive. Your mind models their mind modeling your mind. And that recursion, that infinite regressive social calculation, demanded a brain of extraordinary power. Here is where the evidence becomes compelling. Across all primate species, there is a remarkably tight correlation between the size of the neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for complex thought, and the size of the social group, not the complexity of diet, not the range of habitat, social group size. Robin Dunbar demonstrated this relationship in the 1990s, and it has held up to rigorous scrutiny ever since. The bigger the typical social group, the bigger the neocortex. The relationship is nearly linear across dozens of primate species. Humans sit at the extreme end of this line. Our neocortex predicts a natural social group of roughly 150 individuals. This is known as Dunbar's number. And remarkably, this number appears again and again in human social organization, military companies, village sizes, corporate departments, online social networks. But 150 meaningful social relationships is an enormous cognitive burden. Now add deception to the equation. Primates deceive each other constantly, They hide food. They suppress mating calls to avoid detection by dominant males. They form secret alliances. They pretend not to notice things they have clearly observed. Tactical deception is rampant in primate societies, and deception creates an arms race. If you can deceive others, you gain an advantage. But if others can detect your deception, your advantage disappears. So deception gets more sophisticated, and detection gets more sophisticated. And deception escalates again, and detection escalates again. This is an evolutionary arms race with no finish line. Unlike the arms race between predator and prey, which eventually reaches equilibrium, the social arms race is open-ended. Every cognitive improvement in one individual creates selection pressure for cognitive improvement in everyone else. The ratchet only turns one direction. And this, many researchers now believe, is why human brains grew so fast. Not because Africa got drier, not because tools got more complex, but because humans became the primary selective pressure on other humans. We were our own evolutionary engine. But the social brain hypothesis explains more than just brain size. It explains something far more interesting. It explains why humans developed what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions that are different from your own. Theory of mind is the cognitive foundation of everything that makes us human. Without it, you cannot truly cooperate. You cannot teach. You cannot learn by imitation. You cannot negotiate. You cannot tell stories. You cannot deceive effectively. You cannot love in the way humans understand love. And theory of mind appears to be rare or absent in most other species. Some great apes show rudimentary theory of mind. They can anticipate what another individual might do based on what that individual can see. But the depth of human theory of mind goes far beyond this, layers upon layers of mental modeling. She thinks that he believes that I intend to share, but I know that she is only pretending to trust him. That single sentence requires at least 4 nested levels of mental modeling. Humans do this effortlessly. We do it constantly. We do it in every conversation, every negotiation, every act of storytelling. This is what the social brain produced. But there's a darker dimension to this story that we need to confront. The social pressures that drove cognitive evolution were not gentle. Coalition warfare between groups appears to be ancient. Skeletal evidence of violence goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Humans were not only cooperating with each other, they were killing each other. And warfare creates its own cognitive demands. Planning ambushes, coordinating group attacks, defending territory, reading the intentions of rival groups, anticipating raids, forming alliances with neighboring bands against common enemies. These are profoundly complex cognitive tasks. Groups with better social coordination survived. Groups without it perished. And the survivors passed on the neural architecture that made coordination possible. Generation after generation, the pressure intensified. Now here is the crucial connection to our central mystery. The social brain hypothesis explains why brains got bigger over millions of years. But it also helps explain why symbolic behavior eventually emerged. Because at some point, the social complexity exceeded what could be managed through direct personal experience alone. You could track 30 relationships through memory and daily interaction. Maybe 50. But when your social world expanded to 100 to 150 people, including people you saw infrequently, you needed external signals. You needed ways to communicate identity, allegiance, and status that worked at a distance. You needed symbols. A string of shell beads around your neck could say more in an instant than an hour of personal interaction. It could say which group you belonged to, what your status was, whether you were available for alliance. The beads were social technology. The ochre painted on skin was social technology. The patterns engraved on objects were social technology. Every early symbolic artifact we have found can be understood as a tool for navigating an increasingly complex social world. The social brain did not just get bigger. At some critical threshold, it began to externalize its operations. It began to offload social information onto objects and marks and colors. It began to build symbolic systems. And once it started, there was no going back. But symbols require something else to function. Something that may be the single most important innovation in the entire history of life on this planet. Something that transformed not just communication, but the very structure of thought itself. Symbols require language. And language changes everything. Chapter 7. The language breakthrough that changed everything. When did humans begin to speak? This may be the most frustrating question in all of paleoanthropology. Language leaves no fossils. Words dissolve in air. Syntax does not fossilize. Grammar leaves no trace in the archaeological record. We are trying to find a ghost. And yet language is arguably the single most consequential adaptation in the history of life. Every symbolic artifact we have discussed, every engraved ochre, every shell bead, every deliberate burial depends on language. Not because you need words to make a bead, but because the meaning of the bead requires a shared symbolic system. That shared system is language. Without language, a shell with a hole in it is just a shell with a hole in it. With language, that shell becomes a marker of identity, a signal of alliance, a token of relationship. Language is what transforms objects into symbols. So when did it begin? Let us start with what we can actually observe in the fossil record. The hyoid bone is a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that supports the tongue and is crucial for speech production. A Neanderthal hyoid bone found at Kabara Cave in Israel, dating to roughly 60,000 years ago, is virtually identical to a modern human hyoid. This suggests the physical apparatus for speech existed at least that far back, and probably much further. The base of the skull also provides clues. In modern humans, the base of the skull is distinctively flexed, creating a longer pharynx, the vocal chamber that allows us to produce the full range of speech sounds. This flexion appears gradually in the fossil record. Homo heidelbergensis, living 500,000 years ago, shows partial flexion. This suggests some vocal capability, though perhaps not the full range of modern human speech. The anatomy was developing long before symbolic artifacts appeared. Now let us consider the genetic evidence. FOXP2, sometimes misleadingly called the language gene, is crucial for the fine motor control of the mouth, tongue, and larynx needed for fluent speech. The modern human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acid changes. Both of those changes were already present in Neanderthals, based on ancient DNA analysis. This means the modern version of FOXP2 existed at least 500,000 years ago in the last common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals. The genetic machinery for speech has deep ancient roots, far deeper than most people realize. But having the equipment for language is not the same as having language. A piano does not make music by itself. You need a pianist. And a pianist needs not just fingers, but also an understanding of music, a cognitive architecture that turns mechanical capability into meaningful expression. The cognitive architecture for language is what truly matters. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. Language is not simply communication. Many animals communicate. Birds sing elaborate songs. Whales produce complex calls. Vervet monkeys have distinct alarm calls for different predators. Communication exists throughout the animal kingdom in rich and varied forms. Language is fundamentally different from all of this. Language has syntax, the ability to combine a finite set of words according to rules to produce an infinite number of meaningful sentences. This property, sometimes called discrete infinity, is unique to human language. Nothing else in nature possesses it. With syntax, you can talk about things that are not present. You can talk about things that happened in the past. You can talk about things that might happen in the future. You can talk about things that do not exist at all. You can lie. And you can tell stories. Pause on that for a moment. Before language was syntax, every piece of information was bound to the present moment and the immediate environment. After language was syntax, information was liberated from time and space entirely. This was not an incremental improvement in communication. This was a phase transition. Suddenly, knowledge could be transmitted across generations without direct experience. A grandmother could tell a grandchild about a drought she survived decades ago. A hunter could describe the behavior of prey he encountered 100 miles away. Experience was no longer individual. It became collective. But the implications go even deeper than information sharing. Here is something that will change how you think about thinking itself. Language does not merely express thought. Language structures thought. The categories of your language provide shape how you perceive and interpret reality. Before language was syntax, thought was likely imagistic, emotional, procedural. You could picture a scenario. You could feel fear or desire. You could plan a sequence of physical actions. This is sophisticated cognition, and many animals possess it. But with language, thought gained a new architecture. You could now construct propositions. If this, then that. You could chain logical relationships. You could hold abstract categories in mind. You could think about your own thinking. You could evaluate your own plans before executing them. Language gave the mind a scaffolding it never had before. And this scaffolding made possible something unprecedented in the history of evolution. It made possible cumulative culture, the ratchet effect, the ability of each generation to build upon the knowledge of the previous generation without starting from scratch. Without language, every generation begins almost from zero. A chimpanzee mother can demonstrate nutcracking to her offspring. The offspring learns through observation and practice. But the technique cannot be refined through verbal instruction. It cannot be discussed, analyzed, improved upon through collaborative conversation. With language, a toolmaker could explain not just what to do, but why. They could share principles, not just procedures. They could transmit the reasoning behind a technique, allowing the learner to adapt and improve upon it. This is why human technology stagnated for over 1 million years and then began accelerating. The Acheulean hand axe persisted virtually unchanged for 1 million years. Think about that. 1 million years of making the same tool. This was a culture of imitation, not instruction. Each generation copied what they saw without a linguistic framework for improvement. Then something shifted. After 100,000 years ago, tool technologies began changing faster. New techniques appeared. Regional variations emerged. Innovation spread between groups. The tempo of cultural change accelerated in ways that imitation alone cannot explain. Language was the accelerant. But language did something else that may be even more important than cumulative culture. Language created shared intentionality. The ability of 2 or more minds to focus on the same goal, with mutual awareness that they are doing so, and with the ability to coordinate their actions through verbal communication in real time. A wolf pack can cooperate in a hunt through instinct and learned behavioral cues. But they cannot discuss strategy before the hunt. They cannot assign roles verbally. They cannot debrief afterward and plan improvements for next time. Humans with language could do all of this. And shared intentionality transformed every domain of human life. Cooperative hunting became dramatically more effective. Resource sharing became more organized. Childcare could be coordinated among multiple caregivers. Defense against predators and rival groups could be planned and rehearsed. But perhaps most crucially, shared intentionality enabled something entirely new in the world. It enabled collective fiction. Shared beliefs about things that exist only because everyone agrees they exist. This is the deepest magic of language. A shell bead has no inherent value. But if your entire group agrees that shell beads represent status or alliance or trustworthiness, then shell beads acquire real social power. That agreement is a collective fiction maintained through language. Every human institution rests on collective fiction. Every social norm, every system of kinship, every religious belief, every concept of justice, none of these exist in the physical world. They exist only in the shared linguistic space between human minds. Language did not just help humans communicate better. Language created an entirely new dimension of reality, a shared mental world layered on top of the physical world, a world of meaning, story, identity, and belief. And once that world existed, it began to evolve on its own terms. Cultural evolution, powered by language, began operating alongside biological evolution. And cultural evolution was fast, incomparably faster than genetic change. Ideas could spread through a population in a single generation. Innovations could leap between groups through contact and trade. The human mind was no longer evolving alone. It was co-evolving with culture in a feedback loop of staggering power. But we need to be honest about what we do not know. We do not know exactly when full syntactic language emerged. The estimates range wildly, from 200,000 years ago to as recently as 50,000 years ago. The fossil and genetic evidence gives us the hardware timeline, but not the software timeline. Some researchers argue that Homo heidelbergensis had proto-language, a system of meaningful words without full syntax, as early as 500,000 years ago. Full syntax may have developed gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. Others argue that full language appeared suddenly, perhaps through a single genetic mutation that reorganized the brain's connectivity, creating the neural architecture for recursive syntax in one dramatic leap. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. What we can say is this: by 100,000 years ago, the evidence for symbolic behavior strongly implies that language existed in something close to its modern form. You cannot maintain the kind of symbolic systems seen at Blombos without language. You cannot coordinate the production and exchange of beads across social networks without language. You cannot maintain shared meanings for pigment colors and geometric patterns without language. The artifacts demand it. And so we arrive at a picture of the human mind 100,000 years ago that is both familiar and alien. These people had language. They had theory of mind. They had symbolic thinking. They had the cognitive architecture for everything we recognize as human. They were, in every meaningful neurological sense, us. But their world was still small. Their populations were still fragile. Their symbolic traditions still flickered and faded when groups became too isolated or too few. The engine was built. The fuel was loaded. But the fire had not yet reached the temperature needed for sustained, irreversible cultural combustion. Something was still missing. And what was missing was not inside the mind at all. It was between minds. It was the density and frequency of connections between groups. It was the web of exchange and interaction that would transform isolated sparks of symbolic culture into a self-sustaining blaze. Across Africa, around 100,000 years ago, something began to change in how groups related to each other. Objects began moving across landscapes in ways they never had before. Materials appeared at sites hundreds of miles from their geological sources. Obsidian from volcanic highlands appeared at coastal sites. Shell beads from the ocean appeared deep inland. Ochre from specific geological formations appeared at distant rock shelters where no such formations existed. Someone was carrying these objects. Or more precisely, many someones were passing them along, hand to hand, group to group, across vast distances through networks that no single individual ever fully traversed. These exchange networks were about to change everything. Because when minds connect to other minds across space and time, when symbolic cultures begin to interact and merge and compete, something emerges that is greater than any individual mind could produce. What emerges is civilization in embryo, and it was about to be born. Chapter 8. How networks of minds created intelligence. Imagine you are standing on a ridge in what is now southern Kenya. The year is roughly 100,000 years ago. Below you, a dry river valley stretches toward distant volcanic highlands. The air smells of dust and wild sage. You are watching a small group of people, perhaps 15 of them. They are resting in the shade of a rocky overhang, sorting through a collection of objects spread on a flat stone. Some of those objects do not belong here. There are shells. Small, pierced, polished nacreous shells with traces of red ochre pressed into their grooves. The nearest ocean is over 200 miles away. These people did not walk to the coast. Someone else brought these shells partway. Then someone else carried them further. And there is obsidian. Black volcanic glass, sharp enough to slice skin at a touch. The nearest obsidian source is a highland quarry, perhaps 150 miles to the north. Again, no single person carried it the entire distance. You are witnessing something that no other species on Earth has ever accomplished. You are watching a network. Not a digital network, not a trade empire. Something far more fragile and far more revolutionary. A web of relationships connecting separate human groups across vast landscapes. This is where everything changes. Not inside a single mind, not within a single group, but between groups. In the spaces where strangers meet, exchange objects, share information, and then part ways again. The symbolic mind was born in individual brains, yes, but it survived because of connections. Let us be precise about why this matters. For most of human evolutionary history, groups were isolated. Small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 people wandered their territories, occasionally encountering neighbors, sometimes violently. Knowledge existed, but it was trapped inside tiny populations. Remember the flickering pattern we discussed. Symbolic behaviors appearing at one site, then vanishing for thousands of years. Elaborate beadwork at Blombo's cave 75,000 years ago, then apparent silence. Engraved ochre, then nothing. Innovation arising, then dying with the small group that invented it. This is not a mystery of intelligence. It is a mystery of demography. The people who made those early symbols were just as cognitively capable as you are. Their brains were anatomically modern. They had language. They had theory of mind. What they lacked was connectivity. Think about it this way. You are a genius born into a band of 30 people. You invent a new way to haft a stone point onto a wooden shaft using plant resin and sinew binding. It works beautifully. Your hunting success improves dramatically. But your band is isolated. A drought strikes. Disease follows. Within 2 generations, your band is reduced to 9 people, none of whom learned your technique thoroughly. Your invention dies with them. The archaeological record shows a brief flicker of sophistication, then a return to simple forms. Now imagine a different scenario. You are the same genius, same invention, same small band. But your group regularly meets 3 neighboring bands at a seasonal gathering point. You demonstrate your hafting technique. Others watch, learn, modify it. They carry the knowledge back to their own territories. Now the invention exists in 4 separate populations. If one band suffers a catastrophe, the knowledge survives in the others. If someone in another band improves your technique, that improvement can flow back to you. The network becomes a reservoir of knowledge larger than any single group. This is the argument that anthropologist Joseph Henrich has articulated with devastating clarity. Individual intelligence matters far less than collective intelligence. The size and interconnectedness of your social network determines the complexity of your technology and culture, not the raw power of any single brain. Henrich demonstrated this principle with a striking natural experiment. Tasmania was connected to mainland Australia until rising seas severed the land bridge roughly 12,000 years ago. The Tasmanian population, isolated and numbering only a few thousand, gradually lost technologies their ancestors had possessed. They lost the ability to make bone tools. They lost the ability to catch fish with hooks. They lost the ability to make cold weather clothing. Not because they became less intelligent. Their brains were identical to mainland Australians. They lost these technologies because their population was too small to sustain them. The network had been cut. And without the network, the cultural ratchet slipped backward. Now project this principle back 100,000 years. What was happening in Africa was not simply that people were becoming smarter. They were becoming more connected. Exchange networks were forming, slowly, tentatively, linking groups that had previously existed in near total isolation from one another. The evidence is scattered but unmistakable. Obsidian moved from highland sources in East Africa to sites over 300 kilometers away. Marine shells appeared at inland sites far from any coast. Particular types of ochre, chemically traceable to specific geological deposits, turned up at distant locations. These objects did not teleport. They moved hand to hand, group to group, through chains of exchange that we can only partially reconstruct. Each exchange point was a node in a network. Each node was a place where information could be shared alongside objects. Think about what must happen for a shell bead to travel 200 miles inland. Two groups must agree to meet. They must establish enough trust to approach each other without violence. They must communicate effectively. They must recognize that the objects they exchange carry value beyond their immediate material utility. A shell bead has no survival value in itself. You cannot eat it. You cannot use it as a weapon. Its value is entirely symbolic. It means something. Perhaps it signals alliance. Perhaps it marks identity. Perhaps it carries obligation, a debt that must be repaid at the next meeting. Every one of those possibilities requires language, theory of mind, shared intentionality, and the ability to project relationships across time. The shell bead is not a decoration. It is a social contract made physical, a promise you can hold in your hand. And here is the critical feedback loop. The more groups exchanged objects, the more they needed symbolic systems to manage those exchanges. The more symbolic systems they developed, the more complex their exchanges could become. Networks drove symbolic complexity. Symbolic complexity enabled larger networks. This is a ratchet that does not slip backward easily, because the network itself provides the redundancy that prevents cultural loss. If one group forgets how to make a particular tool, they can relearn it from a connected neighbor. The knowledge is distributed, not concentrated. Robin Dunbar's number becomes crucial again here. A single human can maintain roughly 150 meaningful social relationships. But through networks of exchange, the effective social world of any individual expands enormously. You know you're 150, but your contacts know they're 150. Through just 2 degrees of separation, a single person is connected to tens of thousands of others. Information, techniques, stories, and symbolic conventions can flow through these extended networks far faster than any individual could carry them. The network thinks, the network remembers. By roughly 100,000 years ago, these networks were beginning to stabilize in parts of Africa. Not everywhere, not continuously, but with increasing frequency and geographic reach. The flickering pattern of symbolic behavior was becoming a steadier flame, fed by the oxygen of human connection. Some researchers call this the tipping point. When network density crosses a critical threshold, cultural complexity becomes self-sustaining. Innovations accumulate faster than they are lost. The ratchet clicks forward with increasing speed. Each generation inherits more than the last and adds to the total. This is why the cognitive revolution was not a single event. It was a network phenomenon. Brains provided the hardware. Language provided the software. But the network provided the infrastructure that made the whole system function reliably enough to build upon. Without connection, genius is a candle in the wind. You might ask what drove the formation of these networks. Climate is part of the answer. During periods of environmental stress, isolated groups faced extinction. Those willing to establish relationships with distant neighbors gained access to resources, information, and mates from a wider geographic area. Connectivity was a survival strategy. Population growth is another factor. As human populations slowly increased in favorable periods, the distance between neighboring groups shrank. Encounters became more frequent. The cost of establishing and maintaining exchange relationships decreased. Networks formed not by grand design, but by the accumulated logic of countless small interactions. And once formed, networks created their own selective pressure. Groups embedded in exchange networks had access to better tools, more diverse food sources, and larger mating pools. They outcompeted isolated groups. Over time, connectivity became not just advantageous, but essential. The networked replaced the isolated. This is a profound realization. We think of intelligence as a property of individual minds. We celebrate lone geniuses. We imagine the cognitive revolution as a moment when a single mutant brain lit up with unprecedented brilliance. But the evidence tells a different story entirely. Intelligence, as we experience it, is a collective phenomenon. It lives in the spaces between minds. It is sustained by relationships, exchanges, conversations, and shared symbolic systems. A human mind in isolation is remarkable but limited. A human mind embedded in a network is genuinely without precedent in the history of life. 100,000 years ago, on ridgelines and riverbanks and coastal caves across Africa, that network was weaving itself together, strand by strand, shell by shell, conversation by conversation. The symbolic mind had been born. Now it was learning to survive, and it was about to do something extraordinary. It was about to create meaning. Chapter 9. Art Symbols and the Birth of Meaning. There is a piece of ochre from Blombos Cave that you should think about very carefully. It fits in the palm of your hand. It is roughly 77,000 years old. And on one of its flat surfaces, someone used a pointed stone tool to carve a pattern of intersecting lines forming a series of diamond shapes. We have discussed this artifact before. But now we need to look at it differently, not as evidence of cognitive capacity, not as proof that someone could think symbolically. We need to ask a much harder question. What did it mean? The honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know. The specific meaning of those cross-hatched lines died with the person who carved them and the community that understood them. We will never recover it. But the question of what it meant specifically matters less than the question of whether it meant at all. And on that question, the evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is too regular to be accidental, too deliberate to be the byproduct of some utilitarian process. Someone sat down and intentionally created a geometric design. This is art. Not art in the modern sense of galleries and critics and auction houses, but art in the deepest sense. The deliberate creation of a visual pattern intended to carry meaning beyond its material existence. A mark that says something. A surface that speaks. And art, in this sense, is perhaps the most revolutionary technology our species has ever produced. More revolutionary than fire. More revolutionary than stone tools. More revolutionary than language itself. Because art does something that even language cannot do on its own. Art freezes meaning in time. Consider language. When you speak a word, it exists for a moment and then vanishes. The listener must be present. The meaning lives only in the instant of communication. Even with the prodigious human memory for stories and songs, spoken language is ephemeral. It dies with its speakers. But a carved line on a piece of ochre persists. It can be seen tomorrow. It can be seen next year. It can be carried to another group and shown to people who were not present when it was made. It can outlast the person who created it. It is external memory. This is staggering. For nearly 2 million years, everything humans knew existed only inside living brains. When a person died, their knowledge died with them, unless they had managed to teach it to someone else through direct demonstration or spoken instruction. The bandwidth of cultural transmission was brutally narrow. Art widened that bandwidth. A carved symbol, a painted image, a pattern of beads arranged in a specific sequence. These are information storage devices. They hold meaning outside the brain. They allow meaning to travel across space and persist across time in ways that speech alone cannot accomplish. We should be careful not to project modern categories backward. The people at Blombos Cave were not writing. They were not creating art for aesthetic contemplation. They were almost certainly doing something far more practical and far more urgent. They were using symbols to manage their social world. Think about the shell beads. Dozens of nacreous shells, carefully selected for uniform size, pierced with deliberate holes, stained with red ochre, almost certainly strung together and worn on the body. These are not random decorations. They are identity markers. When you wear a particular arrangement of beads, you are broadcasting information. You are saying, I belong to this group. I hold this status. I have these alliances. I am bound by these obligations. You are compressing complex social information into a visual signal that can be read at a glance. In a world of expanding networks, where you increasingly encounter people you do not personally know, such signals become essential. You cannot sit down with every stranger and explain your entire social history through conversation, but you can wear your identity. You can display your meaning. Archaeologist Mary Steiner has argued that the standardization of bead types across wide geographic areas is evidence of shared symbolic conventions. When groups separated by hundreds of miles use the same types of shells, prepared in the same way, it suggests a common symbolic vocabulary. This is culture in the fullest sense. Not just shared behaviors, but shared meanings. Not just doing the same things, but agreeing on what those things signify. A red ochre bead means something specific, and that meaning is understood across the network. This is the birth of convention, the seed of all institutions. Now let us push further. What happens when symbolic systems become complex enough to represent not just identity and alliance, but stories? What happens when marks on a surface can encode narratives? When a sequence of symbols can describe events that happened in the past or might happen in the future? We cannot pinpoint exactly when this threshold was crossed. The archaeological evidence gives us objects, not sentences. But the logic of symbolic evolution suggests that once you have a system for encoding meaning externally, that system will inevitably grow in complexity. Symbols generate more symbols. Consider what stories do. They allow a community to share a common past. This happened to our ancestors. They allow a community to imagine a common future. If we do this, that will follow. They allow abstract principles to be transmitted. This is right. That is wrong. Stories are social software. And stories about things that do not physically exist are the most powerful of all. Yuval Noah Harari has called these shared fictions, and they are the foundation of every large-scale human institution. Gods, laws, money, nations. None of these exist outside the collective human imagination. All of them are sustained by symbolic systems. We are not suggesting that people 100,000 years ago had religions or legal codes or currencies in any form we would recognize. But the cognitive machinery for these things was in place. The ability to create shared meaning, to believe collectively in things that cannot be touched, was already operating. Look at the burials. In the Levant, roughly 100,000 years ago, both modern humans and Neanderthals were deliberately burying their dead. Some burials include grave goods, objects placed with the body, a deer jaw here, a boar mandible there, red ochre scattered over the remains. Why would you place objects with a dead person? Why would you place objects with a dead person? Only if you believe, on some level, that the dead person continues to exist in some form, or that the act of burial carries meaning that transcends the physical disposal of a corpse. Burial with grave goods implies a symbolic relationship with death itself. This is religion in embryo, not theology, not doctrine, but the fundamental human intuition. The meaning extends beyond the visible, the tangible, the immediate. That the world contains significance that must be interpreted, honored, and transmitted. That reality has a depth that the senses alone cannot fathom. The birth of meaning was also the birth of grief, the birth of hope, the birth of the entire interior landscape of human experience that we call the life of the mind. Other animals feel pain. Other animals experience loss. But as far as we can determine, no other animal creates symbolic systems to process those experiences. When those first artists carved their crosshatch patterns into ochre at Blombo's cave, they were not merely making marks. They were asserting that the world means something, that patterns matter, that surfaces can carry messages, that the invisible can be made visible through the deliberate arrangement of lines and colors. This assertion changed everything, because once you believe the world carries meaning, you begin to look for meaning everywhere, in the movement of stars, in the patterns of seasons, in the behavior of animals, in the flow of rivers. You become an interpreter, a reader of signs, a maker of stories. And meaning, once created, is ravenous. It consumes everything it touches. It transforms every object, every landscape, every relationship into a carrier of significance. A stone is no longer just a stone. It is the stone where your grandmother is buried. The mountain is no longer just a mountain. It is the place where the world began. 100,000 years ago, this transformation was underway. The archaeological record shows it in fragments. A carved line here, a string of beads there, a buried body with ochre staining the bones. Each fragment is a whisper from a world that was learning to speak in symbols. But the fragments are accumulating. The pace is quickening. The networks are growing. And within this growing web of connection and meaning, something is happening to the human genome itself. Something that the symbolic mind is writing into the very fabric of our biology. The genes hold one final revelation, and it is the most unsettling one of all. Chapter 10. The genetic clues hidden in our minds we have been building toward this moment. Through stone tools and social brains, through language and exchange networks, through art and shared meaning. Each layer of the story has added complexity. Each chapter has brought us closer to the central mystery. Now we must face it directly. What changed in the human brain? What biological transformation enabled the symbolic mind? Was it a single mutation, a sudden rewiring of neural circuitry? Or was it something more gradual, more distributed, more entangled with the very culture it made possible? The genetic evidence is extraordinary, and it does not give us the simple answer we might want. It gives us something far more interesting and far more disorienting. Let us begin with what we know. The human genome has been sequenced. So has the Neanderthal genome, thanks to the remarkable work of Svante Pääbo and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute. We can now compare the two, nucleotide by nucleotide, searching for the differences that make us distinctly us. The results are humbling. Humans and Neanderthals share approximately 99.7% of their DNA. The differences are tiny, but tiny differences in DNA can produce enormous differences in biology, as the 6% genetic gap between humans and chimpanzees amply demonstrates. Among the differences, several genes stand out. We have mentioned FOXP2, associated with language. We have mentioned ASPM and microcephalin, associated with brain size regulation. And we have mentioned HAR1, a stretch of DNA that evolved faster in the human lineage than almost any other region of the genome. Let us look at HAR1 more carefully. HAR1 stands for Human Accelerated Region 1. It is not a gene in the traditional sense, but a regulatory element, a stretch of DNA that influences how other genes are expressed. In chickens and chimpanzees, HAR1 is nearly identical. It barely changed in 300 million years. But in the human lineage, HAR1 accumulated 18 changes in roughly 6 million years. That is an extraordinary acceleration. And HAR1 is active in the developing human brain between 7 and 19 weeks of gestation, precisely when the cerebral cortex is forming its layered structure. Catherine Pollard, who identified HAR1, has suggested that it plays a role in shaping the distinctive architecture of the human neocortex. The folds, the layers, the vast expansion of cortical surface area that gives our brains their characteristic wrinkled appearance. HAR1 may be part of the blueprint for the thinking surface of the mind. But HAR1 is not alone. Pollard and others have identified over 2,700 human accelerated regions in our genome. 2,700 stretches of DNA that were nearly frozen for millions of years in other lineages but changed rapidly in ours. Most are regulatory elements. Most are active during brain development. This is not a single mutation. This is a genomic symphony. Thousands of small changes, each adjusting the timing, location, or intensity of gene expression during the construction of the human brain. No single change created the symbolic mind. The symbolic mind emerged from the accumulated effects of thousands of tiny adjustments. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Many of these genetic changes appear to have occurred not before the emergence of symbolic behavior, but alongside it. The genome was not simply producing culture. Culture was influencing the genome. This is called gene-culture coevolution, and it fundamentally transforms how we understand the cognitive revolution. The traditional model assumes that a genetic change produced a new cognitive ability, which then produced new cultural behaviors. Mutation first, culture second. Biology leads, culture follows. But the evidence increasingly supports a different model. Cultural practices create new selective pressures, which favor genetic variants that enhance those practices, which enable more complex cultural practices, which create new selective pressures. Biology and culture do not proceed in sequence. They dance together in a spiral of mutual transformation. Consider lactose tolerance. Most adult mammals cannot digest lactose. But in human populations that practice dairy farming, a genetic mutation enabling adult lactose digestion spread rapidly. The cultural practice of herding came first. The genetic adaptation followed. Culture changed the genome. Now apply this logic to the symbolic mind. Perhaps early, rudimentary symbolic behaviors, enabled by brains that were already large and socially sophisticated, created selective pressures favoring individuals who were slightly better at symbolic processing, better at reading social signals, better at learning language, better at remembering and manipulating symbols. Those individuals would have been more successful in the increasingly networked social world we described in earlier chapters. They would have formed better alliances, secured better mates, acquired more resources through exchange. Their genes would have spread, and those genes would have further enhanced symbolic capacity, enabling still more complex cultural behaviors. The spiral accelerates. Each turn of the helix, biological and cultural, amplifies the other. This is why the cognitive revolution was not a sudden leap, but a gradual acceleration. Not a light switch flipped in a single generation, but a fire slowly building, fed simultaneously by genetic fuel and cultural oxygen. The FOXP2 gene illustrates this beautifully. The two amino acid changes that distinguish human FOXP2 from the chimpanzee version appear to have been selected for roughly 200,000 years ago. But FOXP2 does not create language by itself. It enhances the fine motor control of the mouth, tongue, and larynx needed for speech. The gene is useful only in a context where speech is already being attempted. If early humans were already producing rudimentary vocalizations, any genetic variant that improved vocal control would be powerfully selected for. The cultural behavior of speaking created the selective pressure that refined the genetic capacity for speech. Language did not spring fully formed from a mutation. It co-evolved with the genes that support it. The brain shaped language. Language shaped the brain. And both shaped the social world, which in turn shaped both the brain and language. Three forces spiraling upward together. SPM and microcephalin tell a similar story. Both genes regulate brain size, and both show evidence of strong positive selection in the human lineage. But the selection appears to have occurred in waves, not all at once. Different variants spread at different times, suggesting ongoing adaptation to changing cognitive demands. Some variants of microcephalin entered the modern human gene pool through interbreeding with Neanderthals roughly 37,000 years ago. This means that some of our cognitive genetic heritage comes not from our direct ancestors, but from a closely related species. The symbolic mind has hybrid origins. This discovery should shatter any simple narrative of human cognitive uniqueness. We did not evolve our minds in isolation. We borrowed genetic material from populations we encountered, interbred with, and ultimately replaced. Our genome is a mosaic, assembled from multiple sources, shaped by cultures we can barely imagine. And the process is not over. The human genome is still evolving. Genes associated with brain development show signatures of recent positive selection within the last 10,000 years. The agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, the invention of writing. All of these cultural transformations have created new selective pressures that continue to shape our biology. You are not the endpoint of evolution. You are a snapshot in an ongoing process. Your brain is the product of millions of years of biological evolution, intertwined with hundreds of thousands of years of cultural evolution. And those two forces are still at work in you right now as you process these words. Now let us assemble the full picture. The revelation we have been building toward across this entire narrative. The symbolic mind was not created by genes alone. It was not created by culture alone. It was not created by climate, or social pressure, or language, or exchange networks, or art, or any single factor we have discussed. It was created by all of them, interacting simultaneously in a self-reinforcing spiral that no single cause can explain. This is the answer to the central question. What made us human? Everything. All of it. Together. At once. In a process so complex, so recursive, so deeply entangled that separating cause from effect is not just difficult but fundamentally impossible. The human mind is not the product of a revolution. It is the product of an emergence. An emergence is when a system of simple components, interacting by simple rules, produces behavior that none of the components could produce alone. Water molecules do not individually possess the property of wetness. Neurons do not individually possess the property of consciousness. And no single evolutionary factor individually possesses the property of humanness. Humanness emerged from the interaction of biological evolution and cultural evolution, operating simultaneously on brains that were embedded in social networks, that were growing in size and complexity. The symbolic mind is an emergent property of a system, not a product of a cause. This is why the search for a single trigger has failed. There was no single trigger. There was a threshold, a point at which the system became complex enough to sustain itself. And that threshold was crossed, not in a single moment but gradually, unevenly, in different places at different times across Africa over tens of thousands of years. 100,000 years ago, the system was approaching that threshold. The networks were forming. The symbols were accumulating. The genes were being refined by the very culture they enabled. The spiral was tightening. The flame was steadying. And then, somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, The threshold was definitively crossed. The system became self-sustaining. Cultural complexity could accumulate faster than it could be lost. The ratchet held. The flame became permanent. What followed was an explosion unlike anything in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth. Within 50,000 years, humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica. They had developed hundreds of distinct languages. They had created art of breathtaking sophistication. They had begun to reshape the planet itself. All because of a primate species stumbled into a feedback loop between its genes and its culture. A loop that, once established, generated ever-increasing complexity with no obvious ceiling and no off switch. A loop that is still running in your brain. In this moment, in these words, the genetic clues hidden in our minds do not point to a single moment of creation. They point to a process that is still unfinished. They tell us that we are not the product of a past event, but participants in an ongoing emergence. The cognitive revolution did not happen to our ancestors. It is happening to us. So here you are, at the end of this journey through deep time. 100,000 years compressed into a single sitting. You have walked alongside your ancestors through African savannas and coastal caves. You have watched them carve the first symbols and string the first beads. And now you know the answer. Or rather, you know why the question was wrong. There was no single leap. No solitary genius whose mutant brain illuminated the darkness. There was instead a web. Genes weaving with culture. Minds weaving with other minds. Biology weaving with meaning. The symbolic mind was never a thing that someone invented. It was a process that invented itself through the interaction of evolution and imagination, of DNA and dreams, of bodies adapting and stories spreading. You are the living expression of that process. Your every thought continues it. But consider this paradox. The mind that asks what made us human is itself the thing that was made. The question contains its own answer. The instrument of investigation is the subject of investigation. We are the universe attempting to understand how it learned to understand itself. 100,000 years ago, on a coastline in southern Africa, someone picked up a piece of ochre and carved a pattern of crossed lines. They could not have known what they were starting. They could not have imagined cities, symphonies, satellites, or the minds that would one day try to reconstruct their world. But in those careful, deliberate marks, everything that followed was already present in potential. Every poem, every equation, every declaration of love, and every act of cruelty. Every question ever asked about what it means to be alive. All of it, latent in a handful of carved lines on a small red stone. You carry that inheritance. The network is still growing. The spiral is still turning. The story is still being written, and you are both its reader and its author. What will you carve into the ochre of your own time? If this journey changed how you see yourself, subscribe to our channel. More revelations from deep time are coming. The story of who we are has only just begun.